A very good afternoon. Welcome to the refractive subspecialty of the AIOS. Yes, Arya, can we have the video, please? Volume, please. So a very warm welcome, respected judges, moderators, panels, and so welcome to the AIOS Refractive Subspecialty Day 2021. And on board we have an introduction, and all our chief are busy in the meeting. So we'll take the liberty to start the session 1, and it is basically an imaging session. I welcome the moderators for this session, Dr. Gaurav Luthra, Dr. Susan Jacob, Dr. Rajesh Sinha, Dr. Shashi Kapoor, and the chairpersons, Dr. Mahipal Sachdev, Dr. D. Ramamurthy, Dr. Namrata Sharma, and Dr. Sanjay Chaudhary. Welcome on board, sir, and thank you for accepting the invite. So how do I read the maps? So to begin with, we have our Professor Dr. Pankaj Sharma. He's a senior professor at the SMS Medical College, Jaipur, and he'll be talking on Pentacam. Sir, your time is 8 minutes.
Yeah. Oh, before starting, Pankaj sir, your first 3 talks are 8 minutes, then followed by remaining 3 talks on epithelial mapping, eye tracy, and one more talk by Rushad Sharaf and Gairi Kundu of 6 minutes talk.
Yes, sir.
So please stick on to your timing, sir.
Yes, sir. Sure, sir.
You can go ahead, sir.
Okay. I'll start sharing my screen now. So I hope this is visible.
Yes, you are visible and audible.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first total virtual AIOS conference. Now, I'll be speaking something about the elevation maps or the Scheimpflug imaging. Why elevation-based tomograph? Because if you give a glass or a spectacle to an optometrist and an ophthalmologist will just give you the power of the glass, where an optometrist will give you the anterior posterior curvature, lens thickness, overall diameter, centration. So he'll give you the actual lens performance. So that is the importance of elevation-based tomography. The basic assumption in a surface tomograph is that we take a simulated K. All ophthalmologists are usually accustomed to the simulated K. However, the elevation-based tomograph, it is a high-speed rotating camera in which it actually takes the elevation points on the cornea, anterior surface of the cornea, the posterior surface of the cornea, the iris, and actually it then correlates it with the best fit sphere. It is like, for example, if you take these points from the center of the earth, these height have no meaning whatsoever. However, if you take a baseline of the sea level, we can have an actual elevation and depressions we can see. So similarly, in the cornea, this dark line is the cornea. Whatever it comes, whatever the part comes up below the best fit sphere is the depression. The other one is the elevation, or the flattening or the steepening. This is the elevation curve of the anterior surface has a curvature of about 8 mm. So we take a float of 8 mm and everything appears all right. Here it is an astigmatic cornea in which we can see that the elevations, this horizontal line is above the best fit sphere. So this axis is the flatter axis, and this is the steeper axis, which has gone, the periphery has gone behind the best fit sphere. This is again a similar thing. This is a regular astigmatism. And so instead of a best fit sphere, here we have taken a sphere of 8.13, which is the average of the K1 and K2. However, if we take a toric ellipsoid, if we choose this as a toric ellipsoid, everything becomes normal. So regular astigmatism, we need to take a toric ellipsoid so that we can know these elevations. But here we have differential elevations in the inferior part on the posterior surface. In this elevation is actually an ectasia. It is not an astigmatism. So in this case, we have to take a best fit sphere. If we take a best fit toric ellipsoid, it will not have any meaning. So a BFS should be taken for ectasia and best fit toric ellipsoid to find out about the regular astigmatism. Another thing is the decentered apex syndrome. If this reference axis passes to the center of the cornea, it's all right. But if this reference axis is slightly does not pass to the center, we can have an asymmetric bow tie or a skewed radial axis on a topograph. However, if we see the elevations, this reference axis is here, the center of the cornea is here. This gives a false impression of an inferior steepening. So the elevations actually are the true way of knowing the curvature of the cornea. This now coming to the maps, the axial map is the similar map to what we get in a topograph, in which we use this equation of the refractive index of the first minus the second surface divided by the radius of curvature. So we can have this map, which is similar to a topographic map. Then we have a tangential map in which 1.5 mm of zone is points are taken, and instead of using the mu1 minus mu2, the Snell's law is used, and this gives a localized power in that area. So in the tangential map, we actually see an increase in the power in the periphery. This is what we call the positive spherical aberration. So tangential maps usually are only used for localized defects in the cornea. For example, if we have flattening of the cornea due to corneal opacity, or we have marginal degenerations, only then this tangential maps are of any meaning. Then we can have a true net power map in which we calculate the anterior power and the posterior power in that particular point, and then we get the true power at that point. This is not simulated K. This cannot be put in the IOL calculation formula because all of those take the simulated K. This is important only for post-refractive surgery when you want to get the true net power of the center of in the visual axis, and secondly for the KPD, which is the keratometric power deviation. If there is a significant difference between the true net K and the simulated K, then that means that the posterior surface is not in a line with the anterior surface. Then we have the pachymetric map. We can have so many the pachymetric values from all over the cornea. The important is the thinnest local, the pachy apex, and the pupil center. We can actually know how much this thinnest local is below or above the apex of the cornea for inferior steepening and keratoconus. Then we have the pachymetric graph in which this thickness from the central to the 2 millimeter, 4 millimeter, 6 and 8 millimeter zone, we can have two standard deviation above or below. So we can know that this thickness, whether it is a normal change in the thickness or it is a ectatic in which there is a differential thinning in the center and suddenly it comes back to normal. Then we have the enhanced ectasia. Enhanced ectasia means it is the correlation of ectasia with the pachymetry. Normally, if there is ectasia, the generalized best fit sphere becomes steeper because these steeper values come into play. So what we do is we take the values of the part of the thinnest area and we remove that and then we calculate a flatter best fit sphere, and this gives a enhanced ectasia. Here we can see the best fit sphere of 6.57. We take a best fit sphere of 6.67 and this gets enhanced. So we get the cone, we can see clearly. There's another thing in which we can compare the maps. We can have a map of 2017, 2019, 2019, 2020. We can see over the 3 years, there hasn't been any change. We can even take the difference in the two maps. Then we have to see if there's any error in the reading. We can see the skewed radial axis here. We can see that here it looks like as if there's an inferior steepening, but on the Bellin-Ambrosia, it's normal with a thinning, which is good. And then there are so many other things, but
Sir, I request you to please conclude.
Yeah, it is the last slide. Then we can have the higher order aberrations going from the first order to the 8th order aberration. We can know the exact and also the cataract pre-op, in which we can get the posterior corneal curvatures. We can get the root mean square of the central 4 mm zone, higher order aberration. We can get the positive asphericity of the cornea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. That was really, really insightful.
Thank you so much, Professor Pankaj Sharma. I think we have already, I could able to see our friend moderator of this session, Dr. Shashi is here.
Hi, Kudlu sir.
How are
Shashi.
you?
Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Pankaj. Can we have the next speaker, Krishna?
I request our next speaker, Dr. Namrata Sharma, to please unmute herself, start her camera.
Mr. Speaker, one second. Dr. Namrata Sharma she is our welcome note. So our next speaker of this session is by Dr. Sheetal Mahurkar. She'll be talking about Sirius.
All right. Over to you, chairpersons. Thank you so much.
Is my screen visible?
Yeah, loud and clear. Screen is visible. Welcome, Sheetal.
Yeah, thank you.
You're on.
Thank you. So I will be talking about how do we read the Sirius maps. It's not going ahead. Okay. Okay, so we all know that Pentacam, Galilee, and Sirius are the ones which we use, which topographers are used currently in practice, Pentacam being the commonest worldwide. But a lot of us do use Sirius topographer in practice. And do we really know how to interpret it? Unfortunately, there is not much of a literature which is available, unlike Pentacam. So Sirius topographer uses Scheimpflug camera for the Scheimpflug images, and it uses the Placido disk for the curvature map. So this is a typical multi-map we get. Just a second. We get on Sirius. So it gives you the pachymetry map, the tangential anterior map, and it gives you the elevation map. So before reading any map, it is important for us to see the acquisition quality. Once it is good, we are good to go and read the maps. So the curvature map in Sirius is a true curvature map because it is a Placido based map, unlike Pentacam, where the curvature is calculated from the elevation points, which are the primary data in Pentacam by the differential mathematics. But in elevation map in Sirius, it is calculated by the delta z, which is the point by point difference along the z axis. So it is not a true elevation. So we do not have a numerical cutoff values on Sirius. So once we get this multi-map should be always read with the indices which are given on the right side of the screen. So here we see the summary indices. The most important for me are the pupil and the pachymetry indices. Pupil, it gives you the size of the pupil and offset, which is similar to the angle kappa. And on the pachymetry, it gives you the location of the thinnest pachy and of the apex. So in normal, it should be coinciding with each other or very close to each other. In ectasia, they are far away. The thinnest point is little away from the apex. It gives you different K readings at various pupillary sizes. Now there are shape indices. The important one is the RMS root mean square. Basically, it is a deviation in the regularity of the corneal surface with reference to with a reference surface, which is aspherotoric. It gives you RMS A values for front and back, and the cutoffs are given for that. The most important and the last in the right-hand side is the keratoconus screening maps. So we have the symmetry index for front and back. Basically, it gives you the vertical asymmetry, and I'll come to this again. The second one is the keratoconus vertex, front and back. So basically this is the highest point of the ectasia on the elevation maps. The third one is the BCV map for front, back and total. So this is based on the presumption that the ectasia occurs at a preferential direction, and it basically manifests your higher order aberrations like coma, trefoil and spherical aberrations. So how do symmetry indexes measure? The two, this is a difference between the mean K of these two circles, which are 1.5 millimeter in superior and inferior hemispheres from the horizontal axis. The superior hemisphere is steeper when there are negative values, and inferior hemisphere is steeper when there are positive values. So basically this uses pachymetry, curvature map and elevation map and gives you conclusion as normal, suspect, KC or any other things. The another important map is the keratoconus summary map. On the left hand side, it gives you the curvature, on the left hand side, it gives you the curvature symmetry like SIF and SIB, BCVs and thinnest pachy. On the right hand side, you have maps like tangential, anterior and posterior, the elevation in comparison with the normality, the relative pachymetry map and the notable points. You also can read the PTI and CTSP, which is very similar to your Pentacam map. The most important image for me in this particular map is these notable points, which basically gives you the steepest point on the anterior and posterior surface, the highest points of ectasia and the thinnest point of the pachy. So normally they should not match and they're straddled, but in keratoconus or any ectasia, they should be close together because everything happens at one particular point. So once if the map is of a keratoconus compatible map, it will give you readings of all these steepest points, highest points of ectasia and RMS values. Now there are for follow-up, there are different maps like the keratoconus follow-up map, where you can for 2 to 3 acquisitions, you can actually study and compare the different indices. Then there is a differential map, which gives you the lower image, the difference between the two maps at different dates. And there is a comparative map, where you can compare the curvature, the pachymetry and the indices together of 2 different dates. When we know all these maps, the most important thing is the repeatability of any map. For the series, for keratometry, it's 1 diopter, and for pachymetry, it's 10 microns. So we generally take 3 readings for this, and we do not call it a progression until and unless the dioptric change is more than 1 diopter increase, or a pachymetry which is more than 25 micron decrease in pachymetry. There are cutoff values for suspects as well as normals with the highest sensitivity and specificity for different indices. Now, when we compare the index any index with the diagnostic ability of the BAD-D in Pentacam, for KC, the best one is the RMS-A back at 4.5 millimeter, and for suspect, it is RMS-A back at 8 millimeter. But these are not the 100% diagnostic ability, so we need to correlate the other things. So I'll give you a case example. This is a lady, 37-year-old, came to us with some cylindrical power and vague symptoms. So we did the topography. When we see the maps look, the pachymetry maps, the elevation maps, as well as the curvature map look pretty normal to me. But on the right hand side, if you see, the class is given as suspect keratoconus. Why is it given? Because the SIF and SIB are abnormal. Also, it's RMS-A at 8 millimeter, which is the index comparable to the BAD-D for suspect, is also abnormal. So the machine gives it as keratoconus. But the image which is the most important in the summary map is, if you see all these points, they're straddled away, they are not correlating with each other. So this is not a suspect case or an ectatic case. So this was a case which the patient had inflamed pincushion with a 2 dioptric cylinder at 180 degree, and maybe because of that these indices were abnormal. So it is important to correlate the curvature maps, the indices, your clinical examination, and then decide whether the patient has ectasia or patient has any suspicion of ectasia. Thank you so much for listening to me. So the very interesting point I came about how the Sirius name came. So basically Sirius means the brightest star in the night sky. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you for that wonderful talk.
Really wonderful talk.
So KP, can we have the next speaker?
Yes, I request our next speaker, Dr. Sally Garg, to please unmute herself, switch on her camera, and start sharing the screen, please.
He'll be talking about Galili.
Okay, he'll be talking about Galili. Over to the chairpersons. Ma'am, you can start sharing your screen.
Yes, ma'am. 1 minute.
Ma'am, are you facing any problem?
Can the AV people help her out?
Yeah, sure. Ma'am, you need to open your PowerPoint first.
Yes,
Is it open?
yes, sir.
Then click on share screen, which is on the bottom of your screen in green color.
Yes, sir.
Can you see it? Then
Yeah.
click on that. Then you can see your PowerPoint in a window. You have to select that one, and then on the right bottom of your screen, there is share option. Click on that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. You may start now.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'll be talking about the Galilei imaging. To start with, we can see how the machines have evolved from a Placido disc to the simple keratometer. These are the basic principles of different corneal topographers. We are going to learn about the Scheimpflug-based Galilei topographer. Other Scheimpflug-based are the Pentacam and the Sirius topographers. The Galilei topographer is based on three principles: the dual Scheimpflug imaging, the Placido topography, and the optical biometry. The Scheimpflug principle states that the object plane, the lens plane, and the image plane are not parallel to each other, but intersect in a common straight line, causing an obliquely tilted object to be seen with maximum possible depth of focus and minimal image distortions. So how does the principle works? It captures slit images from opposite sides and they impinge upon the anterior surface at different angles, resulting in two apparent slit images. It is independent of the inclined surfaces. It has a rotational Scheimpflug camera, which takes 50 cross-sectional images from 0 to 180 degrees, analyzing 12,000 data points. It has a static second camera. It accesses the anterior and posterior cornea surface, the anterior chamber depth, and the lens surfaces. There's a 1000 by 1000 pixel charged coupled device camera with 475 nanometer wavelength of a blue light emitting diode. Placido topography analyzes 20 monochrome rings of 200 millimeter diameter. The geometric analysis of the reflected shape gives us the steepness or curvature at a given point. The optical biometry measures the central corneal thickness, the anterior chamber depth, the lenticular thickness, the axial length, and helps in IOL planning. What are the advantages of Galilei? Higher accuracy for both elevation and curvatural data of the cornea. It has an eye tracker system based on the iris pattern recognition, high lateral resolution, and short recording time. How do we interpret the Galilei maps? The basic refractive report has 4 standard maps: the anterior axial curvature, the pachymetry map, the anterior elevation, and the posterior elevation. The anterior axial map with 1 diopter scale is easier to use, faster and simpler to count the color steps one by one in 1 diopter increments. Larger steps of 1.5 diopters may mask typical patterns of asymmetry and astigmatism. Vertical or horizontal asymmetries larger than 1.4 diopters are the risk factors. The thinnest pachymetry value in micron and location in XY coordinates relative to the map center are displayed. The location can be overlaid on the map as a circle. The average central corneal thickness is calculated across the central 2 mm zone. Normal maximum peak of the anterior elevation best fit sphere should be less than 10 to 12 microns, and for the posterior, it should be less than 15 to 16 microns. The refractive metrics indices are present in mm and diopters. The anterior instantaneous curvature, the posterior axial curvature, posterior tangential instantaneous curvature, and the mean total corneal power by ray tracing. Let's have a look at the keratoconus indices. So there's a keratoconus probability indices, the inferior superior index, the irregular astigmatism index, the differential sector index, center surround index, asphericity asymmetric index, opposite sector index, percentage probability of keratoconus, total corneal power and standard deviation of corneal power, surface asymmetry index, and the surface regularity index. I have mentioned the abnormal threshold for all the indices. The key indices are The asphericity asymmetric index, which quantifies as the magnitude of difference between the maximum negative best fit toric aspheric reference surface value and maximum positive best fit toric aspheric reference elevation value. The percentage probability of keratoconus is defined as the optimal threshold for detecting keratoconus. The CLMI index, which is the cone location and magnitude index, characterizes the steepest area of the curvature, and the magnitude of the index identifies the difference between the steepest area and the rest of the curvature maps. The keratoconus prediction index are the parameters which are simulated keratometry, DSI, OSI, CSI, SAI, IAI, and percent area is analyzed. This is the asymmetry map showing the keratoconus indices. The CLMI provides a robust index that can detect the presence or absence of a keratoconic pattern in corneal topography maps. The wavefront data is expressed as the sum of Zernike polynomials called as the corneal aberrations. The Galilei computes corneal wavefront data and the higher order aberrations on the basis of corneal elevation profile. The Zernike polynomials expansion represents the root mean square wavefront error. Here we have shown the higher order aberrations increases from normal patients to patients having suspicious topography and more in keratoconus patients. How the corneal irregularity is contributed by higher order aberrations like defocus, coma, and astigmatism. So the powerful ray traced total corneal wavefront, RMS value for a fast estimate of vision, and adjustable alignment are few of the advantages. And applications are, it is identifying the most suitable IOL for cataract patients, good overall indicator for the vision of a patient, and adjustable alignment helps in decentralized treatment planning. So let's see the applications. Fast screening, as it has most relevant maps and value in one display. Comprehensive overview of the cornea. As we have seen the wavefront display, it reduces the risk of post-surgery refractive surprises. Powerful ray traced corneal wavefront, root mean square value for a higher order aberration for a fast estimate of vision, and adjustable alignment. The Santiago PTA report, it simulates the impact of your LASIK surgery as percent tissue altered and is a significant predictor of post-LASIK ectasia risk and residual corneal thickness. Inputs fields for flap thickness and ablation depth. Comprehensive visualization with an index and graph. It checks measurement alignment on top view and Scheimpflug images, checks for eyelashes or nose shadows on placebo images, and for dry eyes. Fast screening in cataract for normal eyes, measurement of central corneal thickness, anterior chamber depth, lens thickness, and axial length, quick and simple overview of standard IOL implantation, and quality check of biometry scans. This is the way we are calculating the IOL. This is the IOL power calculation map. So asymmetric screening of the cornea with the cone location and magnitude, comparison of two measurements of same eye, manual measurements of other features, and customizable map displays are few of the diagnostic applications. Take-home messages, advantages for pre-operative screening of cataract and refractive patients, convenient and less time-consuming, cost-effective, and other uses are wavefront analysis, pachymetry, IOL calculation, and also for planning LASIK surgery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saili. I think it was a very interesting talk. I think let us move into the one more interesting talk, none other than by our friend, Dr. Rishi Swarup, and he'll be talking about epithelial mapping. Over to you, Rishi.
Welcome, Rishi.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Kudlu. Thank you, Dr. Sunil Goel. At the outset, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to present in this wonderful symposium. I'm just going to share my presentation. I hope my screen is visible and I'm well audible.
Yeah, perfect, Rishi.
Okay, great. So the topic that has been given to me is epithelial thickness maps. And that's actually one of the areas which is of great interest to me because I think it has revolutionized my approach to refractive surgery and also to diagnosis of keratoconus. So epithelium is not a homogeneous layer. It has different thickness in the center compared to the periphery. And we know that the epithelium is the greatest kind of smoothing agent. If you have irregularities in the stroma, it fills up these irregularities and compensates for all the bumps in the underlying layers so that the surface remains smooth for us to see well. So basically, it is this assumption that we are using to kind of make an early diagnosis of ectasias, because when you have an ectasia and the stroma is bulging in front, the epithelium in front of it compensates by thinning a little bit. And that way, your initial topography is maintained normal and your corneal surface may not show very early keratoconus changes, even though your epithelium has started showing changes. And that's the presumption of using an epithelial thickness map in the diagnosis of early ectasia. So this is just like a normal map, and you can see that in general, you have thicker centrally, followed by inferiorly and superiorly, rather than nasally and temporally. Now, this is a classic case of ectasia you can see on the topography on the left side. And is my cursor visible? And on the right, you can see the epithelial thickness map. So you can see exactly corresponding to the area of the cone, you have thinning of the cornea. The cooler colors are thinner colors and the warmer colors are thicker colors. And you can see the thick, it is the thin area of the epithelium is surrounded by a donut of thickened epithelium all around it. So basically the epithelium stops short of the cone. It just starts accumulating around the base of the cone, and that's why you have this donut of thickening. So earliest demonstration of this was with the high frequency ultrasound. Dr. Dan Reinstein's group had shown this in very beautiful studies. And later this was applied in the Fourier domain OCTs once we had this technology. And that's when it became more widespread because it was clinically available. So these are some of the initial papers from Dr. Dan Reinstein's group showing very clearly in different grades of keratoconus how you have this focal thinning at the area of the ectasia surrounded by this donut of thickening. And this paper by David Huang et al. Showed it for the first time in the Octoview OCT, similar kind of epithelial patterns of thinning over the apex of the cone. And several other papers have come after that which have shown, have kind of reiterated the same thing, showing a very good kind of correspondence with ectasia. So this is just one of my patients, and you can see again a clear-cut keratoconus on the topography, and along with that you have on the stromal thickness map you can see a focal thinning, and accordingly you have a focal thinning on the epithelial map. So this is one of those borderline topographies. You have a little inferior steepening, you're not sure what it is. Even the pachymetry map looks okay, but look at the epithelial thickness map, clear-cut focal thinning surrounded by a donut of thickening. And of course, if you look at the fellow eye, it's a clear-cut case of keratoconus with, again, similar changes in the epithelium. Now, one could, one of the very good utilities of epithelial thickness map is to differentiate it from contact lens warp edge. So you can see the above set of images are contact lens warp edge, whereas the lower ones are ectasia. And you can see, you may see steepening on the topography in both, but in the area of the epithelial thickness map, in keratoconus, you will see thinning at the area of warp edge, whereas in warp edge, you will actually see a thickening, focal thickening. So that's the main difference that you can see in, and one of the very easy ways to differentiate warp edge. So what I do now is if a patient of contact lens use is coming for a LASIK, I just do an epithelial thickness map. And if I don't see any evidence of epithelial warp edge, I will not necessarily delay the surgery for 1 or 2 weeks like we traditionally have been doing. If the epithelium is fine, I'd go ahead very soon also. This is one of the more advanced OCTs that is available, MS39 from CSO. The advantage is it combines the topography, Placido topography with a very high resolution OCT. So it gives you both topography as well as elevation data, as well as epithelial thickness maps and stromal topography as well, which is fabulous. So this was just a small study we had done in our hospital to kind of see how epithelial thickness maps might be useful. I'll just, because time is short, I'll quickly run through. So you can see very clearly from normal to FFKC to frank keratoconus how it changes. So we took 40 normals and 40 keratoconic eyes, used the RTView OCT, which gives not 5 but 6 mm central epithelial scans. Now we have more advanced OCTs with larger diameters of epithelial thickness maps. So this is what a normal epithelial map looks like in the cornea. And you can see this is a patient with keratoconus in both eyes. You can see focal thinning at the inferotemporal aspect, and correspondingly, you're seeing thinning surrounded by a donut of thickened epithelium. So we studied a lot of parameters to see what epithelial thickness parameters may be useful. And basically the ones that we found mainly useful were the minimum epithelial thickness, which is shown by an asterisk, and maximum epithelial thickness, which is shown by a plus sign, and one ratio called the R1, which is the minimum epithelial thickness divided by the exact opposite point of the epithelium. And similarly, we have a maximum divided by the exact diagonally opposite point on the epithelial thickness map. And of course, we did a proper statistical analysis. And basically, we found that these are the parameters which were statistically significant: the central thickness, infratemporal, minimum epithelial thickness, maximum epithelial thickness, the R1, which was minimum divided by the diagonally opposite point, R2, maximum divided by the diagonally opposite point, and the maximum epithelial thickness minus the minimum epithelial thickness. I'll just take 15 seconds more. So just
Please.
the other parameters are of course not statistically significant. And based on this, we kind of got these kind of cutoff values for all these parameters. And we saw with many of our patients, and to pleasant surprise, many of the patients were showing a large number of these parameters showing abnormal in the cutoff values. So this, I think, may be a way to quantify the epithelial thickness map, not just look at the value. And this is a case of kind of FFKC. Even here you have one parameter which is abnormal, and of course the pattern is also abnormal. So to conclude, epithelial thickness maps can help us identify early keratoconus and help to screen patients for refractive surgery. It provides additional evidence in diagnosis. And newer devices like the Avanti and the S9 will give us larger diameters, so we can see on a more global scale what is happening even in the peripheral part of the
Thank you so much, Dr. Rishi. It was insightful. I now request the chairpersons to please take over.
Yes,
Thank you, Rishi.
Zubi,
yes, sir.
You are talking almost last 1.5 minutes. That before the talk is getting over, you are keep talking. It was so you need to look at the time whether our speaker is talking or not. Got it?
Yes,
so
sir.
whatever you are doing the conversation, it was everybody was hearing because each talk is of a very short time of 6 minutes. But I think from 4.5 minutes onwards, whatever your conversation, you could able to hear in between. So make sure that when you're talking to someone, mute your camera.
Okay,
mute
yes.
Okay, thank you so much.
So, yeah, so can we have the next speaker, Dr. Vavekar? I think he's busy with the ARC program. Do we have Dr. Gaurav Luthra here? Dr. Gaurav, are you there? Okay, so maybe we can have his talk a little later. Gaurav has his presentation. Gaurav is there. Gaurav, Dr. Vavekar has asked you to talk. So can you take his talk on eye tracing? Gaurav, are you there?
Hi.
Yeah.
I was only able to join now. Like,
okay.
It was
so sorry for the delay.
That's okay. That's okay.
So if you have the talk ready, we can take you now, or maybe after the next talk.
Give me time. Actually, he has sent me a short.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so maybe you can arrange.
Son will take it. Is he available for the talk or not? Because he said
Rushad
in case he can't join.
I think Rushad can talk now.
So we can have Rushad there, and Gaurav, you pitch in the next, right?
Okay.
So can we have Dr. Rushad, and he'll be talking on understanding aberrometry. Welcome, Rushad.
Sure, sir. I'll just share my screen. Is it visible, sir?
Yeah, both audible and visible. So Dr. Rushad is again a young, energetic refractive surgeon. Welcome on board.
Thank you, sir. So I'm going to be talking on understanding aberrometry. Basically, what we have to understand is that the eye is not like a telescope. The eye has an off-axis design. There's a variable aperture. There's accommodation that happens, and there's a changing fixation. Because of this, and because there are certain physiological changes in the eye where the visual axis is tilted nasally compared to the optical axis, the pupil is decentered, the lens is decentered 0.1 mm nasally with respect to the optical axis. Because of all these imperfections, we do not get an optimal optical performance in the eye. When we look at a perfect optical system, an ideal wavefront will create a plane line, as you can see in this image. But the reality is a little different, where we get an irregular wavefront. And this is what leads to aberrations happening inside the eye. So when we look at these, when the actual wavefront travels further than the ideal wavefront, we have what is called a positive micron value, which is denoted in the eye tracy as a blue dash. Whereas when the actual wavefront does not travel as far as the ideal wavefront, we have a negative micron value. The difference between the ideal wavefront and the actual wavefront measured over the entire surface of the optical system is actually what is denoted as the RMS, or the root mean square value. Lower order aberrations include things that are correctable with glasses, including our defocus or spherical powers and astigmatism. And the higher order aberrations are those which are not correctable by glasses. Now, these are denoted as Zernike terms. A lot of people get confused as to what this is. It's basically angular and vertical representation. You're trying to fit shapes to complex mathematical terms so that we can understand them a bit better. So higher order aberrations start from the third order and they go up to 16 orders, but practically useful is between third and the 8th order of aberrations. And you can see these different shapes denoted, which is the trefoil, the coma, and the numerical things at the bottom and the top, which you can see Z3 minus 3 is a denotion of the vertical change and the angular change in the aberration. Now, this is how it actually is shown in graphs that come in various aberrometers. Red, as I told you, is a negative where the wavefront travels less than the ideal wavefront, and blue is where the wavefront travels more. Now, what do these actually cause? They cause certain symptoms. They can cause blurriness, ghost images, halos, starbursts, and loss of contrast. So this is why it's optically important to look at aberrations. There are various different aberrometers available, the OCAS, iTrace, OPD3, iDesign, Xywave, and the AeonEye. Now, these are based on certain principles, like the Hartmann-Shack basically means it's a modified fundus camera with an array of objective lenses. A light is projected and the way the light reflects out in the form of spots is captured by the fundus camera, and it's denoted as an aberration map. In a Chernig's aberrometer, the difference is we project 168 points inside, and then the camera captures how these are changing after reflection from the retina, and this is denoted as the aberration map. In a skioscope like the Nidec OPD3 one, we are basically projecting infrared slit beams, and the reflected light is then captured by an array of rotating detectors, and this gives like a retinoscopic map which denotes the aberrations. And the last one is the ray tracing, where you have, where it's not, it doesn't do the aberrometry together. It has a sequential tracing of laser light, which is reflected in, and the way it deviates from its position tells us the aberrations. So I'm just going to go through a few case examples of importance of aberrometry. This was a 41-year-old radiologist who presented to us with progressive deterioration in vision and an increase in myopia. What was happening was that with progressive myopia, he was getting corrected to 6.5, but his uncorrected vision was dropping significantly. The anterior and the posterior segment looked okay. When we did the pentacam as well as the OCT, it did not show any changes. This is an absolutely normal map. So we ruled out these various different conditions that are there. Then we looked a little bit deeper at this patient in the terms of aberrometry. Now, the good thing about the iTrace aberrometer is it splits the internal and the external, which is corneal aberrations, the internal and the total aberrations. So what we could see here is that the main aberrations were contributed by the internal optics of the eye. Again, the wavefront analysis which the iTrace gives, we can see that this pattern between the internal and total matches. So it's a lenticular astigmatism that is actually happening and causing a poor quality of vision and a scattering of the point spread function in this patient. The iTrace also has a very important feature called the dysfunctional lens index. Anything less than 6 is significant, and in this patient, despite not having a clinically visible cataract, it was about 4.13, showing what is called a preclinical cataract. So with this, we made a diagnosis of a preclinical cataract and lenticular astigmatism, and once the surgery was performed, the patient did much better. This also masquerades post-LASIK regression, and we published that. This is coming back to what I initially mentioned, that the optical, pupillary, and visual axes don't match in the eyes. And because of this, you can have higher order aberrations. This becomes important in multifocal IOLs. If you have a large angle alpha greater than 0.5, it's better to stick to a monofocal IOL in these kind of patients. The second thing to remember is for spherical aberrations, it's always better to keep a slightly positive spherical aberration, which is there from the cornea, which is balanced by the negative from the lens. And therefore, in a patient like this, where you have a slightly further positive spherical aberration, you can balance it with the negative in the IOL. The iTrace also helps us to measure accommodation by giving specific targets. So it has the ability to give you a distant target as well as a near target. And you can look at how differently the refraction is there also in different pupillary zones. So this is a patient with good accommodation, and a different patient in whom the accommodation is nearly lost. There's no change in the refraction. So this is my last slide, just a summary. Basically, these are the different types of aberrometer. The advantage of the ray tracing ones is in refractive surgery and to denote pseudomyopia. The iTrace also has a toric planner and it has a dysfunctional lens index, which is useful in cataract surgery. The Hartmann-Shack aberrometers are basically more useful in refractive surgery. The OCAS is an optical quality analysis system that helps in tear film optics and how the tear film affects scattering of light. And the NIDEC, the OPD3 helps as a topographer, and it also has certain corneal indices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That
Thank you,
was a
Rishad.
wonderful talk.
So Rishad, though we'll take the discussions at the end, but there was a quick question. Do we have any cutoff value for the aberrations? There is a question to you.
So normally higher order RMS between 0.3 and 0.4, not higher than that. It shouldn't, generally 0.3 or less should be.
So the question was for individual aberrations, just like vertical comma or maybe any individual aberration that you would have a cutoff value, or you would take more emphasis on that?
I would take more emphasis on the total RMS, but I would generally look at coma and trefoil, and it should be less than about 0.1 generally.
Okay. Gaurav, can we have you?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
So this is.
So I would request Dr. Gaurav Luthra to please talk on iTracy, and he'll be talking on behalf of Dr. Bhavik. Thank you, Gaurav, for that last minute.
Gaurav was with me. We are together, scientific committee member, our dear closest friend, and happy to
He's
see
a dynamic refractive surgeon.
Also.
Yeah, all to you, Gaurav.
Yeah, one moment. I'm just loading up the. I'm sorry. Yeah, one sec. It's already there. It's. Okay, so I think now I have it. And let me just share it for one moment. Sorry, Sonu, this was like last minute. I was expecting actually.
We are sorry to you and thankful to you.
You know, so I actually have just downloaded it from his email and put it across. So please bear
I can
with me
understand.
if I try to do justice to this talk. So this is on iTrace. I've been using it for a few years, and I think it's an amazing device. And it's a combination of the ray tracing aberrometer, as Rishad just mentioned. It also combines it with a corneal topography, which is Placido based. So it's like an aberrometer plus Placido device. And the good thing is it's a ray tracing aberrometer. And these are all the things that it can do. It can be a wavefront aberrometer, corneal topographer. It's also an excellent auto refractometer. I sometimes, to go back when I'm doing my LASIK workups, I sometimes go back and look on its, axis and the cylinders and everything. It comes out pretty well. You can't kind of blindly trust it, but it's pretty good. And also for our toric measurements and all, you can rely upon them for the autokeratometry, at least for the axis measurements, and then of course a pupillometer and much more actually. So it does a lot. Even the white to white can be customized and measured manually. And then also the angle alpha and kappa. I mean, these are just some of the applications, but there's much more to it. So as we all probably understand now ad nauseum that ray tracing is something which is really catching up in many things. Biometry is going the ray tracing way. Some of the new biometers will be using ray tracing, and the ray tracing formulas are coming up for IL prediction, IL-PAR prediction, which will not be formulas but ray tracing predictions. So it kind of sends these 256 light rays through the entrance pupil and then measures the exact location where the beam hits the retina and comes back, so picks up all the aberrations. And so you can quantify all the wavefront aberrations on the iTrace. And as Rishad just mentioned and made my job much easier, these are all the aberrations which you might be able to see. And then, that helps you in analyzing. So what the iTrace does differently from other aberrometers probably is that it is able to give you a combination of both the corneal topography and the wavefront aberrometry on these maps. And you can help differentiate the two and split them into corneal aberrations and the whole eye aberrations and the internal aberrations. So as this slide mentions, that the applications can be that it can identify the origin of the aberration, whether it is more coming from the cornea or it is more from the lens, or it's the whole eye which is aberrated, and then you can split them into two. And this helps a lot in planning surgeries for refractive surgery, for premium IOLs, and even for toric IOL planning. So essentially, it is very useful for both the cataract and the refractive surgeon. Plus, it can also objectively measure the accommodation, and it helps evaluating the astigmatism much more. In fact, lenticular astigmatism can be picked up pretty well on this. So coming on to some of these slides, I think this is one thing which I like to use a lot, the dysfunctional lens index. There are potential refractive refractive surgery patients where the eye trace will help differentiate between the corneal aberrations. So as you can see on the top left, the cornea seems to be doing a great job, and the the letter is very well focused, but the internal aberration seems to be very high. So when you split them into two and you realize that the lens is probably the one which is causing more of the aberrations, and if this patient walks up to you for a refractive surgery, you'll have to warn him that even though you may do a great job with the refractive surgery, patient's quality of vision is likely to be terrible because the internal aberrations on the lens probably are very high. So this may be, if this is a presbyopic age group patient, he may be more qualified for a cataract surgery or a lens-based surgery. Ideally, I would be looking at this dysfunctional lens index to be in the range of 7 or 8 or more. Anything more than 5 is tolerable, and 8 or 9 is usually what patients normally would have. So this helps differentiate. Again, I think we've got a lot of talk about angle alpha and angle kappa ever since we started doing premium IOLs and refractive surgery. So as we all understand that angle kappa is what we use for refractive surgery when we are trying to do refractive surgery. You don't want to be pupil-centered, and you would like if your angle kappa is very high, you would want to decenter your ablations. Similarly, for premium IOLs, you look at angle alpha. Now, there has been mixed opinion on this. Some people trust this angle alpha a lot for deciding about angle for patients who are to be taken up for cataract surgery, especially multifocals. And there are others who don't find this to be very predictive. But yes, it does have a significant role, and I would definitely look at this before offering premium IOL to my patient. And if it was significant, I would think twice about doing it. The Chang analysis is something which we all use on the eye trace. Again, this kind of differentiates. On the lower side is the corneal, summary, and the upper one is the internal optics of the eye, and on the top right is the whole eye aberrations. So you can see that here the cornea hardly has any aberrations. So all these red and blue things are missing, whereas the internal optics have very high astigmatism. So again, this is the place where you would know whether this patient is going to be good for refractive surgery or cataract surgery. And so this patient with minimal corneal aberrations would be a good candidate if you are deciding a cataract surgery for a premium IOL, because the lenticular aberrations would be gone following the cataract surgery. So here's another patient whose RMS values are very high and the corneal aberrations are very high. So would probably not want to choose this patient for a premium IOL or a multifocal IOL because the corneal aberrations are very high on this map, whereas the total eye may not have as much. And when deciding on aspheric IOLs, I think again a big use here, because you can look at the eye trace can give you the asphericity values of the cornea at the bottom here, and you would like to target your, just like customizing the Q value in refractive surgery, you can customize your Q values and asphericity using this. Since the talk is short, I'll try to go fast. He's given me two cases to show you. A 58-year-old businessman with diminution of vision, high myo, and he evaluated this patient, wanted to get a multifocal lens, has minimal corneal astigmatism, and almost looking like a great candidate otherwise for surgery. But when you look at these corneal aberrations over here, you'll realize that while the total eye aberrations were not very high, but the corneal aberrations are significant. And so this patient probably is going to have a very aberrated vision if we were to go ahead with the cornea with the multifocal IOL. So definitely no multifocal IOL here, and monofocal IOLs may be the advantageous thing to do. And I think this is only second case. He's shown a 50-year-old male, operated for cataract surgery 3 days back elsewhere, having a residual high astigmatism. Now, this is something which I love. We've been evaluating all our post-op toric IOLs at post-op day 1, day 7, day 15, if possible, to look for the toric IOL placement. And the toric check feature on the eye trace is beautiful because it tells you if you had a misplaced, even if you're off by 10-15 degrees, it will tell you that if I rotate this by so much or so much, you'll get a perfect outcome. So when we monitor our patients at 1 week or 2 weeks post-op, we are able to manage these patients really well. And this can be a very, very beneficial thing for torics. I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much for giving me this time, Sonu. And Dr.
Thank
Kudlu,
you, Gaurav. Thank you, Gaurav. It never looked that you have done any unjustification. Wonderful talk, Gaurav. You're a great extempore. Huh? So many of the attendees are people who are starting their phaco-refractive. So a quick question to Dr. Shashi and Gaurav. Do you recommend these people to have an eye trace in their practice for these youngsters who plan to start the refractive surgeries?
So no, I think it can't be bought as the first device that you want to buy. I would love to have a great microscope, a good phaco machine, maybe a small Placido topographer and an optical biometer to begin with. All this comes later when, you are refining your practice and, I find it extremely useful for my practice, but I would not be sure that if somebody had a fixed budget, whether this would come on the top of the list to purchase. That's the only thing. But yes, if you're having a very busy practice and you already have good optical biometers and everything else, yes, definitely you should be having a device like this.
So I think it is second on the list, not the primary for the beginners. So thank you, Gaurav, once again. KP, can we have the next speaker, please?
Just adding on to Gaurav's this thing,
Yeah.
I do a lot of presbyopic laser refractive surgery. Especially, it has got a dysfunctional lens syndrome. Whether you want to pick them for presbyon or not, this equipment will be real useful for me, because sometimes a patient might be expecting or micromonovision and everything. In the end, patient may not be happy. I think if you're having this device, especially if you're doing a presbyopic laser refractive surgery, this is must and should.
I completely agree, Dr. Kudlu. Yes. There's just one thing I'll quickly say, because I know you are short on time. There have been 1 or 2 instances where, there was a patient who had nothing to, I couldn't do LASIK, I couldn't do anything, was being evaluated for ICL, and young patient, 23 years old, showing significant dysfunctional lens index, significant impact like 2 or 3, did not want a clear lens exchange at all. And I went ahead and did an ICL. Surprisingly, patient gained about 2-3 lines of best corrected visual acuity over the best refraction and was very satisfied. So, you have to kind of take all these devices and what they tell you with a pinch of salt sometimes as well. So use your, judgment from lots of devices, not just from one index, which will, or even the angle kappa or alpha for that matter. Let's kind of give, enough to all the devices that we use. That's all.
The take home, I think, is a message that it's a great device where you need to solve those problems in certain cases. So, KP, can we have the next speaker, please?
Let's talk by Dr. Gairik Pundu. He'll be talking about artificial intelligence in refractive surgery.
I would like to thank AWS. Thank you, Sonu sir,
Welcome,
KP sir,
Gairik.
for giving me this chance. I'll be speaking on artificial intelligence, more to do with refractive surgery and keratoconus. I have no financial interests. So my field of interest, I am currently pursuing a PhD in artificial intelligence, and I'll be speaking on the various aspects of work we are doing, looking at obviously the time constraints. It would be brief. So, not only as practitioners or clinicians, we have multiple tools and diagnostic tools and indices which we keep looking at or hearing. But the challenge obviously lies in trying to figure out what do we make of it, or what do we actually look at it. If you're looking at keratoconus, there are not only diagnostic tomographical parameters, you also have to look at high risk scoring or demographics, which can play a role in these cases. So what normally happens is that we are not really able to combine many of these parameters, and that's where artificial intelligence comes into play. Is the human bias in looking at parameters which we're comfortable with, or things which we are actually more aware of, is what we normally look at, and that's where AI comes into the picture. This is no imagination will replace clinicians, but can be used as an add-on tool to our current practice. So artificial intelligence looks at algorithms which normally we don't look at, the various permutations and combinations, various connections at many levels. It can be imaging, it can be correlating demographics, high risk characteristics with imaging. So there are a lot of permutation and combinations which sometimes we are not really able to figure out as clinicians, is where AI comes into the picture. What we did, and many of the work we do, is something which looks like a decision tree classifier. So there are various classifiers when you're looking at AI. The main concept of artificial intelligence is you put in data, whether it is indices, whether it is demographics, and it helps in building this tree, which looks like a tree, a branching tree. And each one of these nodes or these points are actually one of those factors or determinants, whether it's an index, whether it's a high risk score. So there are various classifiers. What we normally use is something known as a random forest classifier. There is something known as a neural network, and there's something known as a SVM, which is a support vector machines. RF classifiers in majority of our work has had the the best area under curve, and that's the reason why we use RF classifiers. So what we did, first aspect of work which started 2 years back, was looking at keratoconus and how keratoconus progression can be detected and predicted earlier. And that's the work we've been doing. And we've built a database of over 450 patients, looked at each one of those time scans, and utilized that to develop an AI algorithm. What is important is two aspects. One is known as a training data set, and one is known as a testing data set. We input all of this information into the AI and teach the AI what it's supposed to look for. Now, how do we test it? We can either use a separate data set and test it, or within the training data set itself, there could be a small subset of data which can be used for validating what you have actually taught the AI. So that's an important aspect of utilizing something known as a training data set and a testing data set. Now, what we did differently in the lockdown, just prior to the lockdown, this is way back last year, is we were finding a lot of patients who were coming in. Surprisingly, they were stable prior to the lockdown, but some factors might have changed as to why many of them started progressing. Now, this can be extrapolated to all patients of keratoconus, but the AI we have built on demographics were on a subset of patients who actually progressed. And we looked at the various demographic profiling, high-risk characteristics. If you're looking at vitamin D, B12, Ig levels, hours spent outside, hours spent indoors. These are the other factors which we looked at. So this is something which we have also added to the AI algorithm. So what we found is a lot, combination of indices, which is what is important. What is also interesting is that AI was also able to use these high-risk characteristics. If you look at classification between progressors and stable, it used vitamin D as one of the parameters, which we normally don't look at. Also, we classified patients who had a progression of more than 2 diopters and classified it as aggressive progressors, and IgE, which we normally don't look at, an IgE which is more than 800, suggestive of a large number, a high systemic allergy. These patients also were picked up in the artificial intelligence algorithm. So this is the paper which we recently published. The first aspect, which is the imaging, the demographics is something which is still under review. Now, epithelium can be a confounder. What happens is, I think Rishi sir has spoken very well about epithelium and the role of epithelium, is that it can actually mask many changes. Even post-refractive surgery, an epithelium healing pattern can give us clues as to how the outcome would be. And this is a slide which is basically trying to show us that there are many modes of epithelial healing. Even routine procedures, routine preoperative topographies can heal in a different way. And that's what is important for us to understand. This is the next aspect of work which we published, where we looked at a subset of patients who had undergone refractive surgery and quantified the indices from the OptiView scan, in these cases, no financial interests, and derived at something known as epithelial Zernike's indices, which were either focal changes or global changes. And what we figured was that an AI was able to pick up a suitable procedure by just looking at the epithelium. So we are obviously far away from it, from clinical translation, but feeding all of this data gave us better understanding on how epithelium could be a way to look at post-operative outcomes. So there are various applications. We looked at keratometry. We looked at patients who had ectasias using epithelium. We also looked at patients who had regression. These were all the validating data points which were fit in to the algorithm. Now, what also happens is that many of the topographers actually do not look at where we're actually supposed to be looking at, and that is actually at the stromal level. Majority of the treatments are actually treating the stroma, and epithelium can be a confounder in these cases. And therefore, studying epithelium is very important in addition to looking at topography, because the current topographers cannot really dissociate the epithelium. So where we are actually supposed to be looking at is what the arrows in red signify. We have also done a study on MS39, which is an epithelial tool using these multiple indices. And what is important is that majority of the parameters which are picked up by artificial intelligence to distinguish between a normal or an FFKC or a KC was the level of Bowman's. So it's trying to say that, the Bowman's level imaging is what is essential in these cases. So AI has obviously changed the way we look at, this is again a paper which we are, it's under review. And there are various aspects of AI, whether it is, if you're looking at topography, if you're looking at demographics, or you're looking at biomechanics, the final revolution would be trying to integrate all of this. Thank you for the chance, and thank you for the patient listening.
Thank you, Gairik. It was a fantastic talk. Now we have got moderators. Dr. Shashi is here. Dr. Sanjay Chaudhary is here. Dr. Gaurav Luthra is here. And all the speakers and also panelists for the discussion. Dr. Shashi.
Can we have all the panelists to open up their videos so that they can benefit all the attendees here? Dr. Rishi, Dr. Sanjay. So, KP, I think it has been a wonderful session, and quick questions to all our speakers. Any questions?
So my question to Gairik, you told about that. I think you are working on with all the maps.
Yeah.
So this is especially this is a subspecialty day. Someone wants to start refractive practice. So what topography machine you advise? So or anything extra to add on to that?
Right. So when we are building and looking at AI, we obviously need multiple tools to build up a database, right? So my aim of AI is not to tell people who are starting off is to invest in all the instruments. Just like you have obviously budgetary constraints, people might want to invest on a Cirrus or want to invest on a Pentacam. What I'm trying to say is that it's the institutes which have the privilege of having multiple topographers or multiple tools is where the AI work or building up a database can happen. Now, for clinicians or private practitioners or small-time group practitioners, it's obviously not possible to invest in all. The ultimate aim of all of what I spoke on AI is to build in plug-in tools, right? So these are plugging in tools in respect to whether it's Pentacam, in respect to any epithelial device. What the clinician needs to do is just fit into certain parameters of whatever the equipments they have. We utilize our database and try to build a nomogram. That's what we're trying to do. This is obviously far away. This is something which we are still in the stage of testing and validating, and that's where the papers are coming out. The final run would be utilizing the know-how of multiple institutes in the country and validating it to multiple practitioners. So that's where we see AI going forward. It's still very early on.
So that doesn't answer one question. If a practitioner is picking up his first topographer,
yeah,
which topographer do you think should be picked up as the best tool for his practice?
Okay, so we've done studies on repeatability of tools. Scheimpflug based devices is what I would consider as anybody to start off with investing on. I have no financial interest. We have analyzed and done patient analysis of Pentacam, Cirrus, Topo, and Galilee in both normals, in keratoconus, in highly aberrated corneas, as well as in pediatric populations. And we found Pentacam to be highly repeatable in all of these conditions. So, if you're asking for a single answer, yes, a Scheimpflug device such as a Pentacam would be a useful tool to start off with.
Yeah, so I would say the first choice should be a Pentacam, and then if you have the luxury, an iTrace.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would the audience agree with that? The second option?
Yes, sir. I think
I would add that this epithelial thickness map is
absolutely
in refractive.
Actually, I would second you. Epithelium thickness. I think I can't operate LASIK without. I mean, any refractive surgery without.
You can buy an MS39. Everything comes in one.
Okay, which are the epithelial thickness mapping devices currently available to an ophthalmologist?
I think Zeiss and Optoview are both having good epithelium.
Yeah, Zeiss, Optoview has, and CSO has the MS39.
MS39 is beyond. I mean, yeah, it's very
So
actually, we all remember our days. Sorry, please. Yeah, Dr. Sanjay.
Yeah,
please
so I would say the Zeiss epithelial mapping comes with the OCT platform, right?
Yes.
So that means of all the platforms, then you need an iTrace, you need an OCT with an epithelial mapping, and you need a topographer. That's quite a bit of investment for a beginner.
I don't think you need an aberrometry unless, I mean, wherever you have a LASIK machine, anyway, you're going to have your aberrometry, whether it's in your clinic or in your LASIK center. So you essentially need to invest in a good topography. And I would suggest if you have to buy another equipment, it should be something which can give you epithelial thickness maps.
Well, I think what I recommend is that you should have a topography, a basic topographer at your own clinics. And maybe the center where you are operating, that center must have an iTrace and a Pentacam. So that is the easiest way where you can do a pachymetry and a basic topography at your own center. Yes. And then the patients can be operated at wherever center you want. And in cases of doubt, you can always analyze, go back on the Pentacam, on the iTrace. Because we remember our days, we all, when we started our practice, I mean, the topography was the basic equipment that we all bought and then we upgraded ourselves. So stressing on these youngsters to have all these equipments at one go, I don't think that will be, it'll be too
You're
taxing
right,
on the
Sonu. Sonu, you're absolutely right. I would say that a Placido topographer to begin with would be just what most people would be able to do.
in their basic
And maybe
clinic
an
setup.
optical biometer after that. And then, of course, comes a pentacam and then an epithelium mapping and then an eye trace in that order, I would think. And yes,
Yeah.
you can utilize centers which already have these for getting your tests. And many people utilize at our place. We keep getting a lot of referrals for pentacam and eye trace and several things. And we are happy to help people who want to
I
get
think
them.
through this platform, we all should, the practitioners who are established should help these youngsters to grow their practice and help them out, trying to get in a culture of a group practice so that all can, start practicing and, get their own practices.
Can I also add a point? I mean, we are moving towards hybrid machines very soon. There are machines which are integrating an abrometer with a topographer. MS39 is a good tool which gives you everything. But yes, costing is an issue. If that can be brought down, and the fact that we can integrate many things, whether it's epithelium with a topography and a abrometer, is where we are actually moving ahead in the next decade.
I think, Eric, one more thing, the Cirrus also does meibography for you. That's another feature of the Cirrus. Where it's a little helpful. So, you can...
So now the second question is, how often do you maintain or calibrate these high screening devices? Because we keep using them, and suddenly they start churning up wrong data. We don't realize that, and we use that data for on the eyes of a patient.
So actually, none of us would be doing this on a regular basis. It is only on an SOS basis whenever it crashes or whenever you have some fallacy being reported. So IDLE would be having an engineer who would do a calibration on a regular basis for us.
Most of these equipments are in AMC, sir. So when they come, they just come and do it during the regular AMC visits.
Yeah, so they have a 3 monthly AMC, but the instrument can go wrong anytime. And then they say you have to do a calibration every day in the morning before you start using that equipment. That is what the recommendation comes to, so that your data for the day is accurate. It's just that recently we had a problem with the topolizer and we went through a lot of problems. So this was a message that came across that you're supposed to calibrate it every morning. Then comes the third question. We keep using this instrument once bought for years and years. And there's a decay in the instrument and it starts giving wrong readings. So then exchanging the same equipment with the new equipment is again a problem. I'm talking it from a very practical point of view. So normally they say about 6 years is the decay time, but I still have to see some practitioners who junk their machine and buy another machine in 6 years. So what does the panelist have to do? What do you think is a decay time for a good imaging sensitive system?
Whenever I'm buying an equipment, I plan in my head 5 years. And I've seen on an average, it's 5 years you have to change most of our diagnostic equipment.
That is a very expensive proposition. Where does the old equipment go?
Buyback.
All these multinationals hardly give you anything as a buyback. They just adjust it in their price.
That's all. Yeah, but beyond that, this equipment will anyway start troubling you.
Dr. Gaurav, your eye trace, how old is it?
So my Pentacam, it's the fourth one in the last 10, 12, 13 years, I think. And yes, it has a life and almost all devices. So I think, maintaining them well, between 5 to 7 years is the time that you can. And yes, you are kind of dependent on the companies because the only option is to give a buyback. They'll usually give you 3-4 lakh rupees. And, actually it's equivalent to just a discount so that they can retain you as a customer. So I think that's a very valid question. And that's why when buying a new equipment, one should always keep in mind that whether we will be able to justify the cost of that equipment in 5-6 years or not. If we cannot, then there's no worth investing into a very big machine like that. I think are we behind time for the next session?
I would request now.
Sheetal wanted to tell you something. Just Sheetal.
I just wanted to ask actually between Pentacam and Cirrus, because there's a price difference. Would it still matter so much between Pentacam and Cirrus? Because I've used both. I like Pentacam little more, but I feel that it's not a great difference for us to go for Pentacam. So I just wanted to know opinion from the people who have used
See,
both.
Pentacam is a widely used system everywhere. So even if you get a referral from some place, you can almost expect that he is coming with a Pentacam picture.
Right.
So what is very much in common use is sometimes the preferred method of using a tool.
So I think we'll end the first session here.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah.